This is lecture 3 from chapter 13, and we ended the last lecture with talking about half-life. So what we're going to look at this time is how the elements are breaking down and what we can use something like the half-life of an element for practically. So here is the idea of what is happening during half-life. So what we're having happen is what we call transmutation. So we saw in a previous lecture that those neutrons get unstable and they turn into protons. And then you get alpha particles and beta particles breaking away. So those changes are what create this transmutation. And so transmutation is just the changing of one element to another element. And so that's what we're seeing here. So here we are starting with uranium-238. So we've got our radioactive element, and eventually those neutrons start to break down. And so we get our first transmutation. So we start with 92 protons and 146 neutrons. That transmutation happens and we get thorium-234 because we lose 2 neutrons and 2 protons. They eject out. They become an alpha particle and eventually become a helium. If they don't run into anything, remember, they'll become a helium by picking up those 2 electrons on their way. And then this thorium is actually going to transmutate again. Thorium is also a radioactive element, and so it's going to now go, it's got the 90 protons, 144 neutrons in 234 thorium. So we've got our 234 thorium. It's going to undergo transmutation, but this time the transmutation's a little different. When it undergoes transmutation, it's not going to lose an alpha particle. It's only going to lose the beta particle, the electron over here. And when that happens, it gains a proton. So you can see we went from 90 to 91. So that gets us a new element that is one higher on the periodic table, palladium. Wait, is it palladium? Sorry, I can never remember this next one because they start to jump around because they can lose protons, but they can also gain protons if they don't eject alpha particles. They only eject beta particles. And I'm sorry, I don't have my periodic table right in front of me to make sure that that's what I think it is. So here you see the entire breakdown of uranium-238. So uranium-238 starts up here. It's going to break down to thorium and into the reaction we just saw, and it actually turns back into uranium. It's going to turn into uranium-234. Then it's going to go through a cascade where it's going to go to thorium, radium. By the way, I'm not going to ask you to know this. This is just to show you how a radioactive element like uranium goes from one element to another. So radium, radon, polonium, actinium. Then both of these actually break down, and now we get lead, bismuth, polonium. Let's see, that one, I can't remember what TL is. Lead, bismuth, polonium, again, can't remember TL, and eventually we get lead. So uranium-238 actually transmutates through all of these steps until we get lead-206. So it goes through all of these steps, all of these breakdowns, all the way to the bottom. And this actually is an incredibly useful thing to know because knowing the amount of uranium-238 and lead-206 in a rock can give us some very useful information. It actually can tell us about how old the rock is because that gives us the half-life. well, we can basically back calculate the half-life. Because what we can do is use this information to do what we call radiometric dating. So this can be used with any radioactive element. So uranium is very useful because it has such a long half-life. It has that 4.5 billion year half-life, but we can use it with any radioactive element. And I mentioned that there are actually lower number radioactive elements, and that's one that we're going to be looking at here, because the best known radiometric dating element is carbon-14. We don't think about carbon as being radioactive, but there is an option for carbon to be radioactive, and that is this guy right here, carbon-14. So how do we get carbon-14? Well, we get carbon-14 by the transmutation of nitrogen in the atmosphere. So you've got nitrogen-14 up in the atmosphere, and it gets smacked by a neutron. When that happens, now we've got nitrogen getting that extra neutron, so you get smacked in, but a lot of the times what happens is instead of it just keeping that neutron, a proton gets ejected, a hydrogen gets ejected. And so that transmutates that nitrogen into a carbon, because nitrogen 7, carbon 6, and so we get a carbon. Now remember, carbon is normally 12, but because it's got that extra neutron that got added on, plus it's got the extra neutron from the nitrogen, now we get carbon-14. The thing is that carbon-14 isn't actually any different to an organism than carbon-12. So it makes up a very small fraction of carbon in the atmosphere. So this carbon-14 isotope makes up less than 1/1,000,000th of 1% of the carbon in the atmosphere. So it's tiny, 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 tiny fraction. But plants take it up just like they take up carbon-12. So they're going to use it just like carbon-12. So they're going to pull it up, and we know this fraction. So we know how little of the carbon-14 is being pulled in. So we know the amount. And animals are going to then eat those plants. And so they'll take it up in that same fraction. So we know how much carbon-14 is in any plant or animal while they're alive. When the plant or animal dies, however, there's no new source of carbon-14 to replace any that decay. So if you think about it, as you're living, you're continually consuming carbon from your food sources. You're continually getting new carbon-14 to replace any that is going to break down in radioactive decay. But if you die, you're not going to be replacing any of them. So once that happens, any carbon-14 that you have in your body will start to undergo radioactive decay. And so it will start its decay, and it will start basically the countdown of the half-life clock on your tissue. And so this makes it incredibly useful for radioactive dating, radiometric dating. The half-life of carbon-14, we know, is 5,730 years. So after 5,730 years, any carbon-14 in an organism's tissues, half of it will have broken down, and we know what the fraction of that carbon should be in any organism. And so this allows us then to calculate what the age of any remains are as far as a living organism. So here's how we would do that. So we measure it by the amount that has decayed. So here we have an individual who died with their carbon-14. They died 22,920 years ago. Then as we come forward in time, the little red arrows are the amount of carbon-14 left in their remains. So as you can see, as we come forward in time, we're coming forward in those half time steps. So half of the carbon is gone. and again, another half step, half the carbon is gone, half a time step, half the carbon is gone, half a time step, half the carbon is gone. This carbon dating for carbon-14 allows us to measure back 50,000 years, and that's all the farther it will work. Any farther back is not possible because the amount of carbon-14 that's left is too small. Because remember, there's only that tiny fraction of it that's being taken in from the atmosphere. You're not building up a huge amount of it in your tissue, and our detection instruments are not able to detect it any farther back than that. So you might be saying, but I've heard them say that they radiometrically dated, dinosaur remains. That's how we've figured out how old they are. Well, we can because carbon isn't the only element that we can use for radiometric dating. Anything that is older can be dated using uranium 238 or 235. We can also use a couple of other elements. You'll see those in your lab because we can date non-living materials using these. So we can't necessarily date any of the living, the former living materials, but we can date the rocks that they are saved in. So the rock material that's around them was laid down, and we can use those rocks to measure the amount of uranium and lead, because uranium-238 breaks into lead-206, uranium-235 breaks into lead-207 through its half-life, and so we can use that to figure out the relative dates of when those fossils were created. Because the older the rock is, the more lead we're going to find, because that's given more time to break down through that radioactive decay. All right, so the next section is talking about sorry, flip forward. I'm actually going to stop here, and I'm going to start the next lecture with applications of using nuclear reactions on things like power. So that's why you just saw that little quick slide on nuclear fission. So I'll start the next lecture talking with things like nuclear fission and fusion, how we can harness the power of the nuclear atom and radioactivity.